Thank you. I've got a lavalier. Why don't we sit? You guys want to come sit? Figure we have these nice chairs up here. We might as well sit in them. Thank you, David, for the kind introduction. I'll try not to bang my head on this. As you said, I'm Chief Economic Correspondent at Politico. I write a column called Morning Money every day and then write about finance and economics and then talk nonsense on CNBC from time to time and MSNBC whenever they're kind enough to ask me to do that. And I've never actually gone to a disaster site and faked chainsawing a tree for the benefit of my viewers, although I won't give Geraldo too much of a hard time for that. So a lot of topics that we could discuss. I'm going to give each of the panelists a chance to offer a few remarks and tell you a little bit about themselves and where they're coming from, and perhaps if they want to talk about Cuba issues can do that, or hurricane recovery issues where we stand now, both in Florida and in the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. Obviously, we just had the big spending bill passed in Congress, $300 billion additional, including $90 billion in disaster relief. So I'm interested in their thoughts on that, how it's being distributed, whether it's enough, whether more needs to be done. But you didn't come here really to hear from me, so why don't we start with you, Stacy, and if you had a few introductory remarks for us.
So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for your patience in staying here through this. It's been very fascinating. I got the tail end of the last session, which I thought was really from an analytical viewpoint, very interesting for someone who's actually lived through it, right? And as you all may know, the Virgin Islands, the United States Virgin Islands, actually were hit by 2 Category 5 hurricanes. So they were both Category 5 when they hit the U.S. Virgin Islands. First, Irma hit St. Thomas and St. John, and then Maria hit the island of St. Croix. We have never in our history had all 3 islands hit by a hurricane. What usually happens is, in the past, Hugo in '89 would hit St. Croix, and we had the other islands that became then the base camp. Or with Maryland in '94, which hit St. Thomas and St. John, St. Croix was the base camp as well. This was really very outside of the box, cataclysmic, destructive, all the words that have been used for the Virgin Islands. What makes it particularly difficult for the U.S. Virgin Islands is, in fact, the fact that Puerto Rico was also hit. So once your neighbor, who is the, many of you saw the Brady Bunch, right? And remember how Jan is always saying, Marsha, Marsha, Marsha. When you're in the Virgin Islands, you feel like Puerto Rico, Puerto Rico, Puerto Rico, because they're the 3 million person behemoth that sits next door to you. So the energy and the attention and the oxygen gets sucked by that island. Not that so many of us are not related to one another or have commerce, interest between the two. And in some ways it helps because you have a louder voice that's also speaking for you. So what happened after the Virgin Islands was hit was that we have major hospitals on both islands. Both islands' hospitals were destroyed. So if you all looked in the New York Times, there was an article about all of the inpatients, dialysis patients, which have been sent off island and are now being treated there. 9 of our public schools were destroyed. So our children have split shift sessions where they're in school 4 hours a day. I do pop-up visits in the schools because the kids are probably the most interesting people I deal with on a regular basis. And I talked with one of the principals of our high school who said 1/3 of her seniors are failing right now because of the impact from September 6th and what's happening in their lives. So I'm saying all of that to say that the islands, of course, are going to take a long time to recover. But what makes it particularly difficult in the Virgin Islands as well as Puerto Rico is our previous financial issues before that. I came to Congress because I was interested in economic development. I'd been a public finance attorney, was interested in how do you grow economies, how do you create a scale, industry, etc. It's my belief that the Caribbean, which were colonial places, have been in service industries for way too long, and that they cannot sustain themselves on tourism and service primarily as a means for economic growth. This is an example right now. Our revenues are destroyed because of what's happened, both in the Virgin Islands, Barbuda, which is, as you heard, uninhabited, Dominica, which had a large tourism industry. And how do we grow as a region? How do we create new economies, reverse our brain drain, create equities which will allow us to be an area that is productive and can sustain itself without the support of primarily outside aid? And that's something that I think is the key question that we have in the Caribbean. Now, Carlos, of course, will talk about Cuba, which has been a help and a hindrance to many of the Caribbean islands as well. The last administration's decision to open Cuba was, on the one hand, yes, we're going to be able to do agriculture and education together. There may be other things in the region that we can work on, but there was also the question of what does opening Cuba mean to the rest of us in our own economies and what we rely on? And that's something that we're still grappling with as well.
Very good. Thank you for that. And we'll hear from Carlos about the view from Florida and perhaps his views on Cuba. I should also say, in talking about him, I don't think David mentioned that he sits on the House Ways and Means Committee, so you all can thank him after for the tax cuts that you've recently received, and maybe we can talk a little bit about those. But Carlos, over to you.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you, Dave, for this invitation. I'm glad we could make it work. I've been coming to Sarasota since I can remember, because this is where our family chose to vacation for a long time, and we still do so today. So every time I'm coming out here, even if it's something semi-work related like this, it's always a fun drive. And I'm so happy to welcome Stacy to Florida. Stacy's a wonderful colleague. She's a hard worker. She doesn't care which party you belong to. If you can help her and she can help you, she's talking to you. And I think we need more people like that in Congress. So I'm very grateful to have her here in our state. And I should say before I continue that we are a state that continues to grieve today, just 8 days removed from a horrifying tragedy in Parkland over on the other side of the alley. And certainly, I ask everyone to do their part so that this time is different in terms of the response. We cannot accept that this is normal in our country, that every few months we're going to be seeing these images on television and just hoping people can get through it. No, we have to take concrete steps to make sure. I don't know if we can prevent this from ever happening again, but that it happens fewer times, and that when it does happen, it's not as large a tragedy as the one we witnessed last week. So please do your part as a citizen to make sure that the response is meaningful this time. So the Florida Keys, my district, I represent the southernmost district in the contiguous 48, the one closest to Cuba. And we were also hit by Hurricane Irma. The Middle Keys particularly were devastated and are still struggling to get back to pre-storm economic levels and just infrastructure and everything else. Thank you to so many Floridians who helped in the immediate aftermath. Many donations, a lot of support for the Florida Keys. We are on the road to recovery, but like the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, still have a long way to go. Some of the major resorts, which are the big economic drivers in the Middle Keys, those of you who have been there, Hawks Cay, Chica Lodge, they're not even open yet. And being an island chain, we've lost a lot of workers who just couldn't wait any longer to go back to work, so they've moved to other parts of the country. So it has been a difficult experience, but like the people of the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, very resilient people, a lot of character, hardworking people. So the Florida Keys will be back soon, and the best thing you can do now to help is visit. So visit and invite your friends, especially those up north, to visit. Cuba. I always appreciate the opportunity to talk about Cuba, even though sometimes it can be painful. My family's experience is one that you've probably heard many times if you've talked to a Cuban living in the United States. My grandfather was career military. Was eventually charged with being a dangerous person and put in prison for 12 years, tortured, only released when he developed Parkinson's, served 12 out of 30 years. When he developed Parkinson's, he was a nuisance at the prison because then they had to care for him a little bit. So they released him, and by the time I got to know him, he was in a vegetative state. So that's obviously Cuba is always an emotional subject, but as a policymaker, I try to look at it in a very sober way, and I always ask myself what's in the best interest of the United States, national security, economic interests, and of course, right after that, what's in the best interest of the Cuban people, because obviously I feel a very strong attachment and relationship with those who weren't as fortunate as my family was to come to the greatest country in the world. So I supported the current administration's changes to the policy. I think they were fairly modest in nature, but not insignificant. Most of it was designed to really push money away from the Cuban dictatorship and more towards this entrepreneurial class that is developing on the island, something that I think we can all celebrate. At the same time, Cuban-American travel was left untouched, which I think is important because I think people visiting their family members and kind of sharing what it's like to live in a free and democratic society is good for the people of Cuba. One change that I think, at least in the long term, if not in the short term, is going to be very good for Cuba. It was made by the previous administration just days before President Obama left office, was a change to the migration policy. And this is a policy that was both generous and cruel at the same time. Generous because any Cuban that would arrive in the United States was automatically paroled and treated like a refugee. And cruel because so many Cubans throughout the years died because they were essentially invited to come to the United States and take a very dangerous journey. And many of them simply did not make it. So I do think that although it was hard for our community to process, that the change will in the long term be good for the island because Cubans a lot of them will stop thinking about how best to leave, risk their lives to leave, and instead maybe they will take greater ownership of their country and figure out how they can be agents of change on the island. So that's something that I think maybe 5-10 years from now we'll look back and say this was a policy that was necessary at the beginning, the migration policy, because so many Cubans were leaving, because it was in the context of the kind of the peak of the Cold War. But I think over time, the policy probably hurt the island more than it helped. One of the reasons I didn't see eye to eye with the Obama administration or disagreed with the policy of unilateral concessions is because I feared what it could mean for our friends and neighbors and fellow citizens on Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. You think about it, Cuba is a country where there are no labor rights, no labor laws, and environmental laws. Some people celebrate the fact that, yes, there's a lot of preservation in Cuba. Part of the reason for that is because there's no growth and development. But certainly an island that is resource-rich would compete very much with U.S. Virgin Islands, with Puerto Rico, and would compete unfairly. Because as anyone who does business in Cuba or has tried to do business in Cuba knows, you cannot even pay your employees directly. You have to pay the Cuban government, and they essentially pay slave labor wages to ordinary Cubans, and it'd be very difficult for Puerto Ricans and the people of U.S. Virgin Islands to compete with that because they do they do respect human rights and have labor rights, etc. So I'm happy to engage in this dialogue. I don't want to go on because I think we do best when we hear from each other and we learn from each other. But I'm very grateful to have this opportunity and to visit the beautiful community of Sarasota.
Thank you for that, and be thinking of your questions because I'll open it up to you in a couple of minutes, and we'll try not to go too late, but maybe to 3:15 or so, so we'll get some chance for dialogue and questions in. And Stacey, there are a few questions I had for you, but one of them is the efficacy of the federal government response as it pertains to the Virgin Islands so far. We did get that chunk of money finally in the disaster relief package as part of the spending bill to keep the government open. Is it enough? Is it being distributed properly? What more needs to be done?
I think that the overall funding amount is a substantial amount of money. But what I think is not often done is put that money in the context of where the islands were in terms of federal support before the hurricanes occurred. So you have islands that have about a 30% poverty rate. 33% of the children in the Virgin Islands live in poverty. Pretty much the same, higher amount in Puerto Rico. When most states, the poorest state in the United States, Mississippi, receives about 46 cents to every dollar of their general fund comes from federal funding. The Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico receive about 14 cents to every dollar. Medicaid reimbursement, something that I've talked with Carlos about being on Ways and Means, is in the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, there is a cap on how much Medicaid funding that the United States will provide. An arbitrary amount that was set many years ago, and that's as much as we'll give you, even if you have individuals that meet the requirements, the poverty rate, or et cetera. And the match in most states is determined based on income. And in the Virgin Islands pays 55%, the federal government 45% of Medicaid funding. Now in Puerto Rico, both islands decided to do things differently. Puerto Rico said to meet the match and to meet the amount of people that need Medicaid, we are going to borrow money. And I always tell people it's kind of like I have children. If my child is very ill and has to go to the hospital, if I don't have the funding and I had a credit card, I'm going to take that credit card out. And I'm going to deal with the ramifications of it later. The Virgin Islands, being ultra-conservative West Indians that we are, just said, we're not going to give people Medicaid. We're not going to give it to them. So we have a third of the population that do not have health insurance in the Virgin Islands. Couple that with, I'm now on transportation infrastructure. Many years ago, the federal highway formulas were changed for the territories. So much of our infrastructure was crumbling before. We have not had a new school built in the Virgin Islands in over 30 years. These are the kinds of things that when the hurricanes hit, caused additional damage and makes it more difficult for rebuilding and caused, like our hospitals, which were fighting with CMS on the amount of reimbursement they were receiving. They had a formula that was from 1989, and we're fighting with CMS about changing that. Meant that there was no deferred maintenance in the hospitals. All of these are the things that I'm trying to give you examples that mean that although we have the funding, there needs to be an equity in terms of how we receive federal support so that we can draw down on the money that's been given to us to then make the changes that need to occur. Last year, it's so ironic that 2017 made 100 years that the United States Virgin Islands was purchased by the Danish government for World War I as a geopolitical positioning. And during this last year, Virgin Islanders have had really deep discussions about what does that American citizenship mean? How are we going to move forward for the next 100 years? How do we have our young people be able to come back home? Our best and our brightest go to college, go to the United States, and they don't come back because we do not have knowledge-based businesses, other kinds of endeavors that will allow them to be able to sustain the lifestyle that they need. So yes, it's sufficient amount of money, I believe, for the Virgin Islands, maybe not as much as necessary for Puerto Rico. There will be questions about whether or not it can be done within the context of the financial issues that both of those islands have as well. When I think that the United States has lost an opportunity, is losing an opportunity here. And the opportunity is to make Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, which are the two American flagships in the Caribbean, the premier islands, right? You have Chinese investment in the Caribbean. I mean, it is the proliferation of Chinese dollars is enormous in the Caribbean. And they are now creating a foothold in places like St. Kitts, in places like Trinidad and Tobago, which is hugely important in terms of oil and gas. In the Bahamas as well, the ports are owned by that country. What is the United States going to do to ensure that its interests are maintained in the Caribbean region? When we have UN votes, when there are Organization of American States votes against Venezuela, against other places, the Caribbean nations cannot vote with the United States because they must vote with the group that is giving them the support that they need, which would be Venezuela and China. And so we miss opportunities by not using this time period when you're doing the rebuilding of your own areas to show the rest of the Caribbean that you're a safe partner and a partner that can be constructive to the region as well.
If I can add briefly to that, the last campaign in 2016, one of the president's main themes was the forgotten man and woman. Remember that? Well, I would argue that among the forgotten men and women in the United States are the people of Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. And that's why on the Ways and Means Committee, I'm always the one when we're in our meetings deciding how we're going to do this or that or design our international taxation system. I say, what are we going to do about Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands? Because a lot of times they are simply forgotten, which is unacceptable, as Stacy said. I mean, these are Americans, and they are carrying our flag in the Caribbean, and we should do more to invest and to treat them fairly. So we've got some small wins and tax policy, rum cover over, and some other provisions that are helpful to these islands, but we really have to do a whole lot more. I always cite the example of the child tax credit in Puerto Rico. It applies starting with your third child. That's absurd. That's a simple fix that I think we should be able to make, right? So I'm very supportive of everything Stacy said.
Yeah, and I'm feeling a little guilty here after Stacy's remarks. My college roommate and dear friend for all 4 years of college is from St. Croix, and I got the chance to visit him on St. Croix and really
The better island, that's the island I'm from.
got to love St. Croix and the Virgin Islands. And he, of course, got a good education and stayed in the United States. And he's lived in the United States since college, and he goes back and he spends time with family, but does not see the economic opportunities there that he would like to have. Carlos, just to go back on the federal government's role here, and it sounds like the amount of money for the Virgin Islands is sufficient. How it's distributed and formulas going forward are an issue. In terms of the keys and where that stands, and then Puerto Rico more broadly, it seems like to me the Republican Party has had a bit of a change of heart on willingness to spend money, and we've obviously got both the tax cut and the increased spending in the omnibus spending bill. Is there an opportunity to go back and have another shot at it in 2018, or Republicans basically we've spent the amount of money we're going to spend on disaster relief, and 2018, as we've got a midterm election coming up, is probably not the time to add a bunch more spending?
Well, in terms of concern for deficits, it's pretty obvious that in American politics these days that's an issue for the opposition party, for the minority party. It doesn't matter who it is, and I think there's plenty of. I'm sorry. So I think there's plenty. I don't know why this is not working. So there's plenty of evidence that this issue of concern for deficits and debt is an issue reserved for the minority party or for the opposition party in government. It was the Republican Party for 8 years during the Obama administration, and now Democratic colleagues who had not talked about deficits and debt for many years are very concerned, and Republicans are less concerned.
We bring in the Freedom Caucus as well.
Right. The truth is that we should all be concerned, and I think most people understand that the solution to becoming a fiscally sustainable nation or having a fiscally sustainable government is to address mandatory spending, the 75% of the budget that is kind of on autopilot and that doesn't get addressed by Congress each year. So that's something that'll have to be done in the near future. But to answer your question specifically on disaster relief, I think this Congress has shown that it's committed to spending as much as it takes. I mean, we've already spent a record amount by a lot, and if in a few months FEMA starts running out of money or we start getting additional requests from the affected areas, I think you're going to see yet another bill. And it does help, and this is unfortunate that so many parts of our country were hit by storms, but it does help to have the entire Texas delegation, the entire Florida delegation applying pressure to make sure this gets done in a bipartisan manner. So I would say that if needed, the chances of another bill before the end of the year are pretty good.
I would say as well, Ben, and to add on to what Carlos was saying, that two other important bills that I'm not entirely sure will come up, but would be great vehicles for that, would be the Farm Bill and, more importantly, a new transportation and infrastructure bill. Because in those, you would have the ability, particularly in transportation and infrastructure, correct, to put in the funding and the support for places like Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands in terms of our ports, to use us more for transshipment. I had a discussion with someone about LNG throughout the rest of the Caribbean, to put in the kind of investment in public structure as well that these islands need.
And is there any hope for doing that within the context of the president's ideas for infrastructure and public-private partnerships? I mean, they have the idea that you can spend $200 billion in federal dollars and leverage it to $1.5 trillion with public-private partnerships. I mean, you mentioned LNG. Like,
well,
are there opportunities?
I don't think that that may be helpful in Houston. It may be helpful where I grew up in New York City. But the attractiveness of being in the Caribbean to private investors needs to have a greater carrot than what this federal package, what the president's proposal is. Or else they would have been there already, because the amount of support and leveraging of dollars between the federal government, I think it's like, maybe a quarter of federal dollars. He's requesting that the municipalities as well put in money. Well, in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, which are already in debt, they're not going to have that funding to make that correct public-private partnership, that you're going to need more dollars from the federal government to really entice the private sector to come into areas where the risk is very high.
I was also interested in whether you had any differences of opinion with Carlos when he talked about Cuba policy and the difference between the Obama administration's approach and the Trump
administration's. Now you're really trying to start something,
approach.
Because now I got to put on my Democratic hat here.
Exactly. And was there anything in there that sort of jumped out at you as you would do it a different way?
No, listen. I think as someone who really does, for the most part, follow the Democratic Party, Carlos and I always laugh because we're both kind of moderates within our respective parties. We both kind of sit in the middle of the aisle rather than on the extremes. That there were areas within the Obama policy with regard to Cuba that I don't think really he was cognizant or thoughtful about its effect on his own or on the United States' own interests, its flags in the Caribbean. But I also have concern that I think that the partnerships that we as Caribbean islands felt would be available to us through an opening of doors with Cuba were really important. The ideas of education and healthcare, which is desperately needed in our respective islands, was something that people were looking forward to. So I think that we really need to massage this and think collectively about how to be supportive. I'm very concerned as well about human rights violations that are going on in Cuba. The only thing I would point out that I thought is interesting that I've been, and myself and other members, particularly of the Congressional Black Caucus, have been concerned about, is with remittances and with this small entrepreneurial group that's coming and being developed in Cuba. Remember that many of those individuals that are becoming entrepreneurs are individuals who have American citizen or American families. And many of those are not Afro-Cubans. And so you could be developing a middle class and this burgeoning entrepreneurial group that really does not, and Cuba has this complete blindness about color, which I think is unhealthy, that I think would keep those Afro-Cubans as a lower class.
I want to open it up for a couple of audience questions. I just have one more last one for Carlos, and just to change gears for 1 second, because you brought up Parkland and the shooting, and I think a lot of us probably watched the town hall last night, and Senator Rubio and his remarks, and he seemed to move a little bit towards willingness to consider some new gun regulations, raising the age for assault weapon purchases. Do you anticipate this Congress moving at all on gun control legislation?
I think there's a very good chance, and it was encouraging to hear Senator Rubio say last night that he supports raising the age to 21 across the board for all gun purchases. I think that would be a positive step. I also heard him say that he's in favor of limiting the capacity of magazines, which again I think is a positive step. I personally think we need to go a little further. Universal background checks, make sure that all transfers are run through the background check system, obviously strengthen the background check system, allow the CDC to research gun violence in the context of public health, and yes, start looking at some of these guns, particularly the most powerful ones that are sometimes called assault weapons. Now, gun enthusiasts will correct you depending on which gun you're talking about, but anyway, curb the use or limit the use of some of these weapons. President came out today in favor of raising the age to 21. So clearly there is a lot of shifting, a lot of movement in what I view is the positive direction. And I think what these young people who have so courageously mobilized, motivated by love and some anger too, they have the potential not just to get some positive outcomes on this debate about gun violence, but really to kind of reset our political discourse and the way we debate and end the zero-sum mentality, the no-compromise mentality that is the reason why, despite the fact that we have a booming economy, despite the fact that, in part, thanks to our tax bill, I will say we see the economic recovery pushing deeper into our society and reaching homes that had been untouched before. Despite all of that, more people still say that the country's on the wrong track. Why could that be? Well, the answer is our politics. Our politics is so ugly and broken that people remain pessimistic about the country despite the fact that most people are doing better than they were a few years ago. So I think the greatest contribution that this new generation could have, and I will help them to the best of my ability, I don't doubt that Stacy will too, is to change the nature of our politics in this country.
So I differ with Carlos. I think, no, we're not going to talk about it. We're not going to vote on it. And I think the reason we're not going to vote on it is because within the Congress, it's an extremely polarizing discussion right before an election. And if you do not have regular order, Speaker Ryan is not allowing, the control of bills that come on the floor under his leadership means that there's not this free discourse in these amendments and discussions that are going to take place, which could be in an election that is going to be very determinant of who controls the House, one that may be divisive. Now, I think if these young people continue the pressure, most of them are in high school, let's give them 2 years after they're now of voting age. Mm-hmm. I think that will then cause the debate after an election of 2018 to occur.
Very good. Well, we don't have a lot of time, but we could probably have time for one or two questions. Let's start over here.
I have a question, Carlos. As a private citizen, I've traveled to Cuba for 5 years, and I've been there 21 times. And I have a lot of good friends who are the entrepreneurial class that you want to develop. They're cab drivers, they're people at restaurants in their houses, they're tour guides. And they tell me, and I can see it, that this change in policy, stopping tourists from going, is hurting them. It's not hurting the Cuban government. There's 7 people that I've helped start businesses in Cuba, And all 7 of them, if you'd like to talk to them, will tell you that this change of policy is very negative to them. And they don't see anything happening to the Cuban government from that.
I understand
You
that.
explain that to me.
I
how it
understand that
works.
argument, and what I would tell you is that the key here is to find the right balance. So I would like to do everything possible to help those independent Cubans who have benefited greatly from increased visits by Americans to the island. But at the same time, we need to remember why the Cuban government engaged in this negotiation. It's because they needed cash. Their options were, a lot of their doors were closing. Venezuela was going deeper into crisis, and they're even in worse shape today. And by the way, all because of Fidel and Raul Castro, who are the authors and the inspiration for everything that has happened in Venezuela over the last 20 years. So we need to find the balance between trying to help those people, and I think that's what the Trump administration tried to do. They did not reverse the Obama policy. I think it'd be very hard to make that case. I think they made changes to it that push resources more towards this entrepreneurial class and away from the government. And why? Because if we remember, the last time the Cuban government was cash rich under the Soviet subsidies, what did the Cuban government do with that money? They had one of the most robust militaries in the region. They were aggressively exporting revolution to Colombia and to other countries throughout the hemisphere. They were fighting our men in multiple theaters of war. So that's why, for me, it's very important to strike that balance. I want to help the average Cuban while giving the Cuban government as small an opportunity as possible, or no opportunity, to profit, because I know what they do with their profits. They spread their cancer all over the world, as we've seen in Venezuela, which, by the way, there was a media report recently predicting that Venezuela could grow to be as horrific a crisis as Syria, here in our own hemisphere, because of Fidel Castro before his death and Raul Castro today. So I do not want to help those men grow richer, because I know that when they grow richer, more people suffer. So yes, and by the way, my understanding is that a lot of people are still flying to Cuba. A lot of people are still taking cruise ships to Cuba. So the opportunities are there for that, for those independent business owners to continue thriving while pushing people away. As you know, there's a list now of hotels and different establishments that are directly owned by the Cuban military and intelligence services, and what we're trying to do is push resources away from those types of establishments.
We had a question here. I think maybe we'll have time for 2 more.
Thank you so much for being here. I am from Puerto Rico, Utuado. Utuado was the most devastated town in the entire island, because we are surrounded by rivers, lakes, and mountains. Now, my question has to do with funding. The United States has sent to Puerto Rico billions and billions of dollars since 1968, 69, all the way on to the present. And we have a very corrupted government there. And I know for a fact that the money doesn't get where it's supposed to go, because I represent over 180, near 200 small farmers, and they were devastated and nothing has happened. FEMA didn't help them. SBA was not, they could not get loan because they don't know how to pay for it. And the insurance is the insurance from the government that is bankrupt. Now, I need for you, honorable Congresswoman and Congressman, to please keep an eye on the funding. We cannot continue the devastation that has happened in our island, my birthplace, and seeing the suffering, because there's a group up in the top of 100 families who owns everything, and everything goes to them. So how can you help me to help those who are there so we can go direct to the people, direct to the farmers to get the funding that they need to be able to produce so they can feed, especially in times of devastation like it is now.
So I know that in this last funding that came out for the disaster relief, there is quite a large portion that is for agriculture, and specifically agriculture for those who were uninsured and for support of resilience with crops and with livestock, et cetera. The conversations I'm having right now with leadership in the House is about control of the funding and how to ensure that while you are not putting another layer of colonial oversight over people, you are ensuring that the money for recovery goes specifically to recovery and rebuilding. I use the example of Katrina. Katrina actually had an oversight group and an ombudsman or some, of that sort, who really ensured that the funding went to where it was supposed to go. Now, every place has some corruption, every place. And you're going to see loss of funding in many jurisdictions, not just in the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. But how do we ensure that we use this as an opportunity for our children's future? And that's what I see. This money cannot be used in an election year in the Virgin Islands, which this year is for governor as well as myself and others, to ensure that people pay for operating expenses, but that we use this as an opportunity to build for our children.
Okay, I think we're going to have to leave it there. Stacy and Carlos, thanks so much, and I'll turn it back over to the estimable David Kotak to take us out.